slides for me. Hi,
Yes,
everybody.
okay.
Thank you for coming today. Anne Meerwood and Irini Zar are going to be our presenters to talk about some of the work they've been doing for CHEER in Greece. But before we get started, I'm just going to go over a few housekeeping things. Can you go to the next slide, please? So we have a few trainings coming up. The next upcoming will be a safety training at Green with the Floor, and then we'll be doing a 4-hour clinical skills training at Garden Park on 30th. Green with the Floor will also be hosting a 15-hour didactic training the last day of May to June 2nd. If any of your staff at hospitals need training, you can go to our website and find more information about all 3 of these there. Next slide, please. And in case you haven't seen it yet, we will be doing a CHIMPS conference this year, October 30th in Pearl, Mississippi. So save the date for that. Registration will be opening this summer. And our next webinar will be on May 15th. And this will be a few of our designated hospitals talking about staffing and sustainability and how they made it work for them to achieve designation.
Okay, is everything? Anything else, Paige?
Nope, that's it for me.
Okay. So thank you all for coming. We are broadcasting live from Greece. I'm in Greece, in Athens right now with Irini, who's our coordinator in Athens. So maybe sometimes it sounds a little bit distant. That's because we're a long way away from where this is being recorded. So anyway, we're going to be talking to you today about the work that we've been doing in Greece and the work that we're going to continue to do here in Athens, Greece. So just for those of you who may not be familiar with the program, just 1 or 2 slides we're going to introduce you to CHEER and a little bit about where we are. And then talk a little bit about infant feeding in emergencies, and then how and what we're doing out here to support women during their breastfeeding. So, as many of you know, CHEER is the Center for Health Equity, Education and Research. And many of you come to us through the CHAMPS program, which is the Communities in Hospitals Advancing Maternity Practices, which has been largely based in the United States, but CHAMPS is housed in CHEER, which is our center at Boston University. And we've been working with a focus on evaluation and intervention since 2016. Of course, we were the breastfeeding center for long before that. And in the United States, we work with a particular focus right now on Mississippi. And we've done a great deal of work with Indian country. And we are a national member of the U.S. Breastfeeding Committee. And those of you who are familiar with our work and probably more used to hearing us talk about our work with African American populations in the southern United States, and then pretty much all over the country with American Indian and Alaska Native populations. But today we're going to talk to you about the work that we're doing in Greece. So I was aware when I've spoken to some people in the United States, they're not terribly familiar with where Greece is, so I put it up here on the map. And this is Greece down here, so they're in the southern Mediterranean. And the photograph on the side there is of the Acropolis, and actually that's a photo that a friend of mine took, and that was in the winter with the snow there, so there is actually snow. And right now we're in the middle of a thunderstorm, so it's not all hot, sunny weather in Greece all the time. Anyway, that's where Greece is located in Europe. And before we go into the work that we're doing with the refugees and that's specific to that population, I do want to acknowledge that there is a great deal of work ongoing and has been going on, especially in the last 10 to 15 years, in Greece with people who are really supportive of breastfeeding. It has not been a country in the past that has had particularly high breastfeeding rates, but the La Leche League is supporting, is celebrating 15 years here with Raluxor, and there's a lot of work going on here. These people on your screen, actually all the people on your screens, except for me, are all doctors. And so we have a lot of doctors who are lactation consultants. There's a lot of work, and I was actually happy to be speaking this weekend at the conference in Athens, which was all about lactations and really a lot of energy going on. So there's a great deal happening in Greece in the clinical side around breastfeeding. For those of you who are not so familiar with the refugee situation over here, these are some of the pathways that the refugees take to get here. This is how you actually have, sometimes people are thinking like, how can you have refugees from Africa? Well, they're coming all the way through the land bridges, and then people are coming in from the war-torn countries of Syria, Afghanistan, and they come across Turkey, and then they get into Greece. And they either go in through the northern border over the mountains here, or people will come to these islands. All these islands here that you can see close to the Turkish shoreline are actually Greek islands. So that is how many people end up in Greece, because these crossings, although they're very perilous, they're not very far. So many people come to Greece through on little rubber dinghies across these small channels from Turkey to the islands. And so there has been a lot of increased intense conflict in Asia and the Middle East, as you probably have heard on the news, and parts of Africa. People are coming here by land and sea. They're also, of course, going to Italy and Spain. It's not just Greece, but Greece has a very large influx. And, of course, most people that come here aren't actually coming because they really want to get to Greece. They're just coming because they want to come to Europe. And in 2015, when they had over 1 million people come in, there was a lot of transport or arrangements between the different European countries for the refugees to go to other countries. But actually, at this point, the borders are closed. So although there are fewer people coming in, many, many people are stuck here. And there's about 73,000 people stuck in Greece, which is up from 60,000 last year. Greece is already in the middle of a major economic crisis. It's been in crisis for several years now. May just be about to emerge from that crisis, but certainly not an affluent, functioning country like sometimes people think of as some of the Western European nations. It's really had a lot of very tough years. So many of the systems are kind of broken already. And the camps where the refugees are staying are already way over capacity. The shelters are completely full. The aid is backlogged, and the conditions range from fair in some of the camps to really appalling in some of the other camps. And, you know, no blame attached to anybody for any of this. This is a humanitarian crisis, and they're coping as best they can because people cannot go anywhere else from here once they get here. So they've just been kind of piling up. This shows you the record of arrivals of refugees into Greece. And you'll notice I'm saying refugees, not migrants. Refugees is a legal requirement internationally to protect people who seek refuge, who are defined as refugees. And I personally prefer that term just because it is a legal term of a refugee, and you're supposed to offer people shelter if they're refugees. We've started hearing the word migrants a lot more recently, and that seems to me to have overtones of people coming here with sort of just floating about the world or something. But these people are seeking refuge from war-torn countries. And you can see that in 2016 there was a really high, and 2015 a really high numbers of people. And in 2018 the number of arrivals actually increased over 2017, and they're actually increasing again. So the crisis, many people seem to think it's over. It's not actually over. It may not be as dramatic as in 2015, but it's certainly not over. It's continuing to get worse here. Now, many of you probably in public health and international health will be familiar with the picture here of the lady on the right-hand screen. This is a WHO picture, and this woman is breastfeeding her twins. She had twins, and she's breastfed the boy, and she bottle-fed the girl because she would not have enough milk for two babies. And indeed, the baby girl that was bottle-fed died. So I'm not saying that the situation is like that here. However, it is a humanitarian crisis. There is a lot of problems with formula, a lot of issues around safe preparation, access to refrigeration, even understanding the need for refrigeration, the need for cleaning the bottles. There's a lot of problems here. So you can imagine that it's not something that in formula feeding is safe or easy to do. And even with some of the other basics here, they're missing, especially in some of the camps, some of these things like antibiotics, vaccination, etc., which protect formula-fed infants in stable situations. They're just not present here right now. So I would say that the situation is pretty critical and that breastfeeding is pretty important. The WHO recommendation is 6 months of exclusive breastfeeding. It said that the WHO said that would save over 800,000 lives every year if people were to exclusively breastfeed, and most of those lives would be of children under 6 months of age. And diarrhea is the biggest killer out there in the developing world, and it's believed that breastfeeding would prevent half of all diarrheal diseases and a third of all respiratory infections in children in low and middle income countries. So breastfeeding is of critical importance in developing countries and in the situation we're seeing here. And as you know, in a crisis store formula, you must be able to make the formula safely. You also need to have access to enough formula, and you need to know what's appropriate. And what we're seeing is a lot of cow's milk, straight cow's milk used for very young babies here. You need a reliable source of clean water. You need a place to boil and sterilize the water. You need sterile feeding bottles. You need a refrigerator. You need for people not to put the milk back in the fridge 5 times during the day, but to throw it out. And you need people to be able to read the directions. And some of the women we're working with here are not literate, and they're certainly not literate in Greek. So people cannot actually read the directions on the can, so they don't know how much formula to mix. And as you know, the opposite for breastfeeding, you don't need any sterilization, refrigeration, bottles, no money, you don't need to be able to read, and you don't need a special diet. So really, obviously breastfeeding is by far the healthiest. And also in these situations, women are already in crisis mode. There is a lot of distress. There's a lot of lack of confidence. People are, have no power over anything. They're just sort of shunted about. And breastfeeding, with a baby in a crisis like that can be perhaps one thing a woman can hold on to, that she can actually control herself, that she doesn't need outside help. It can be empowering. And, of course, free. And there's a tremendous lack of money here for things like formula and diapers and other things that go along with basic baby care. So the formula, if they don't have that, they can afford some of the other things they need for their babies. So in terms of the breastfeeding rate in general, the people I was mentioning at the beginning, some of the Greek breastfeeding experts, back in 2017, they did do a survey, which unfortunately published in Greek. But initiation in Greece, and that's mainly Greek because they don't have any minorities here, is around about 94%. But the breastfeeding at 1 month drops dramatically to around 40%, and basically no one is breastfeeding at 6 months. And the cesarean rate is at least 60%, probably higher. There's really very little information available, but there are many who say that the cesarean rate is as high as 70% here. So we did a couple of these when we were setting up to do the work, just sort of preliminary pilot work to try and find out what we were with here. So one thing we did was we assessed infant feeding status among the refugee women in the Greater Athens area, analysing some identified data from a group called An Hotel, which sees babies and mothers when they go to this in the middle of Athens to do some lactation support. And so for 6 months, they gave us deactivated data for a 6-month period in 2017 and 2018, and we analysed it to see what was going on. And so we actually had 318 separate mother-infant pairs that we looked at the data from, and they were for 30 different countries, but the most common nationalities were Afghani and Syrian. Among this refugee population, 40% of births were caesarean, and I'll note that, although it should probably be higher, the caesarean rate in Afghanistan is 3%. So many of these women had never had prior caesareans, but were getting them when they came to Greece. 92% of these women did begin breastfeeding, but the median duration of exclusive breastfeeding was only 4 weeks. And the most common reason for starting formula was that people said they didn't have enough breast milk and that they were given formula by a health professional. And I just think that's kind of interesting that, wherever we may be in the world, the reasons that people give for not breastfeeding are quite common, and we're familiar with those reasons in America, in England, in many, many countries. We also found, because we did analyze the data, that not breastfeeding within the first hour of life of these refugee women was associated with a shortened duration of any and exclusive breastfeeding, and cesarean birth was also associated with shorter duration of exclusive breastfeeding, as you could probably predict. So WHO infant feeding guidelines clearly not being met. And then we also decided, well, let's have a look at what's happening from the refugee camps in the area, because the Emergency Nutrition Network have created infant and young child feeding and emergency operational guidelines, which is a bit of a mouthful. That is what these settings, camps, shelters, any kind of emergency setting for women and babies, that is what they're supposed to be following, those guidelines. And they're all nicely printed up in a book. And they have things, like you should have policies and all those sorts of things. So that's who they were designed for. So we looked at the operational guidelines, and we also reviewed the United Nations Refugee Program site profile for the refugee camps in Greece, in the Attica area of Greece, which is the Greater Athens area. And we also interviewed the field coordinators who are responsible for the day-to-day camp operations in the 6 camps in the Greater Athens area. We found that at that time, and it's actually gone up since, but at that time there were 6,000 plus refugees in the 6 Attica camps together. They did have the site profiles, and 3 of the camps said that they had mother-baby safe spaces, but actually we found that really there was only 1 camp that had. And the infant feeding and emergency guidelines recommend policies and training, but none of the field coordinators were aware of any infant feeding and emergency-related policies or any kind of training for any clinicians, staff, or volunteers. The picture you see here is the Scaramangas refugee camp, which is quite close to where Irene has been today. So what are the infant and young child and emergency guidelines? Well, they're basically a reiteration of what the WHO recommends. They're part of the WHO UNICEF Global Strategy on Infant and Young Child Feeding. And as I said, they apply to emergency preparedness and response to minimize infant and young child morbidity and mortality. They recommend 6 months of exclusive breastfeeding. They recommend relevant training for those who work with refugees and other emergency situations. And they recommend policy and guidelines for the settings where the refugees live. But, of course, no one was meeting them. So after this assessment, we decided we better try and do something. So we're currently working in 3 different refugee camps and 1 shelter offering hands-on health. We're offering training at non-profit and agencies based in Athens, and we're recruiting volunteers to help with the work. And I think I'm going to hand over to Irene now to tell you some more about it. But before I do that, I'm just going to our day was today. This is kind of typical of what we do. So at 10 o'clock this morning, Irene and I went to the shelter, and we went through the market with the women, with the pictures at the end. But we went through the market with the women, and we bought vegetables, because mostly what they're eating is rice, onions, and potatoes. So we bought vegetables in the street market. And then it was quite touching to see the sort of response of some of the street vendors, because Greece isn't always the most liberal country, but they were giving vegetables and saying hi to the babies and things. And then we went back to the shelter, and then we cooked with them. And then Irene went off to the Scaramangas refugee camp. I stayed here working on policy. Then we had a meeting with our volunteers, and we went through the growth charts and the policies that we're trying to implement here. Then we went back to the shelter this evening, and we weighed 5-6 babies and talked to a pregnant lady. And that's all in the day's work. And we have our translator, Shaista, with us, and it's now it's 8:30 p.m. here, and we haven't really eaten very much. So this is kind of typical of our day here in Greece. So I'm going to hand you over here now to Irene, who is in the picture here, and she's going to talk to you about some of the hands-on work that we're doing at some of the camps and the settings in the area.
Hello. Yes, this is Irene, and I would like to talk about our work that we do here in Greece. And firstly, I would like to talk about Scaramangas refugee camp. It's actually about 11 kilometers away from the center of Athens, and it's built on an old naval shipyard, as you can see in the picture with the cranes in the background. The residents of Mangas at the moment, they are about 3,000, with 10 to 12 births per month. But there is an estimate of 900 infants below the age of 2 years old, and 38% of the residents are under the age of 18. And as you can see, that's the back of my head, weighing a baby. In the women and baby area in Skaramangas, we installed a weighing scale. And here, if you can see, the scale is being used. And I emphasize on cleanliness. We use a hand sanitizer after weighing every baby, and we wipe down the scale after every use as well. I do not use gloves, as to not imply that, the babies or the mothers themselves are dirty. And I strongly feel that cultural sensitivity is important when I deal with mothers and babies. And I will show you the next slide. As you can see in the picture on the left, with the beautiful, colorful, bright toys that I use for nutrition support groups. It helps to familiarize the children with healthy food, because the access to food that they have is mostly prepackaged food, things already in cans, in boxes, and they find it really hard for the mothers find it really hard to help to get the children to eat fresh fruits and vegetables. And the picture next to it is one of our training days that we did with the Drop in the Ocean volunteers in the camp itself. And of course, a picture of the weighing scale, and that is the picture underneath is the kitchen of the women baby area, where we helped install a sterilizer, and I helped train the volunteers and some of the mothers to use the sterilizer, and it's to encourage the mothers to clean the bottles after every use. And this is the other camp that we go to. It is called Eleonas, and it is one of the earliest camps to open up in Greece. And most of the residents here stay on average for about 2 years before they move on. And CHEER works with Project Elea, and they run all of the educational activities here. They also run the Women and Child Friendly Space, where they designate the Women's Hour, which actually runs for 2 hours. And that is when CHEER goes every Friday to do some activities with the women. And this is what we've been doing, is that we've installed a baby scale, and so we monitor the infant's growth, and also we have support groups. In this camp, particularly, the residents are more interested to get involved with what we do. And most of the times they act as the outreach facilitators. They go find other women to come, hey, let's join this activity, let's learn something. And they also act as volunteer interpreters when times are needed. And this was where I was yesterday. It's an Inofita refugee camp. It's about 60 kilometers away from Athens. And I like to say that I travel with a roving band of volunteer doctors, nurses, and paramedics called MVI. We actually do the care work in a community center about 5 kilometers away from the camp. And it is mostly staffed from the volunteers, from the residents of the camps themselves. So they are actually refugees running the center. And the residents, they travel 5 kilometers away every day to come to the community center to access healthcare, to do activities with the people who come, and give them access to things to do, really. And as you can see in the picture, we installed a baby scale and a measuring chart on the right. We've just started weight checks on the infants and young children, because quite a lot of them are actually above the age of 2. In actuality, I think yesterday I saw 7 mother-infant pairs, and about 10 of the children are above the age of 2 until age of 10. And the most common question I get asked here is that my child is not eating, or my child is not eating enough, and I'm worried. So, it is a lot about nutrition more than actually breastfeeding when in Inofita. And I would like to pass it back to Anne.
Okay. Thank you, Irene. So, as you can see, we really have our work cut out for us. We are lucky that I'm actually have family here in Greece, and I do have a space that I live in, and I'm over here. And literally down the street from this space where we have our offices is a shelter called Provocando La Paz is the group that runs the shelter. They are a group from Spain. They have one of the very few locations in Athens where women can be with young children and families, and very few places will accept, for example, pregnant women, because it's just such a liability. And today we had 2 pregnant women that we saw. One of them is about to have a baby at the time, and the other one in a couple of weeks. And, some of the things that they've really had very little prenatal care. They don't know where the baby will be born. And, for example, one of them told us today, my babies are born very quickly. I'm very worried that I won't be able to get to the hospital. I don't know where I'm going. So that thing is really emergency medicine that we're dealing with. And there are about 20 families there, 60 people total, and most of the people are children, and they have 9 babies under 6 months of age. So it's well known, it's crowded and full, and they have big signs on the door saying no space. They display a couple of families sometimes every day because they don't have any new space. And I think we had great fun. I mean, this is very hard work, but it's also fun to be able to provide these services for women. So the first group session we did there a couple of months ago, we had lots of moms and babies, and they were speaking 3 languages. The main languages they speak is French, Arabic, and Farsi. We have a wonderful Farsi interpreter who comes with us, and I speak French, but we have a real lack of Arabic interpretation. Sometimes we're lucky we can borrow somebody. Some of the kids are beginning to learn English. The young children are speaking English, but we have a real lack for Arabic interpreters. And when we did do that, many of these babies hadn't been weighed since they were born, and there was all sorts of misinformation around. So, for example, we had one baby that wasn't growing well, and they were feeding formula, and so some medical professional had told them to put 6 scoops of formula instead of 2 so that the baby got more food, and of course the baby ended up in the hospital with constipation. So not unnaturally, women had many, many worries and questions, and it was an amazing intercultural experience, because really we had people from several different Arab countries. We had people from Afghanistan, then we had women from Africa. And everyone had, of course, very different perspectives on how you feed a baby. So it's kind of cool to hear them talk to each other and not really understand each other's perspective, and sort of they're wide open-eyed when one woman says, oh, but we should do this, and then someone else might say, no, that's not how it's done. So it's quite interesting to hear all the different things. And then last week, Irene did a session there on reproductive health, which was apparently received with great giggles and interest. And now they actually asked us, please, can you find a man to come and teach reproductive health to the men? And in fact, I think we're sending our interpreter's husband, who speaks Farsi and is well equipped to be able to talk to people about that. But really talked to them about menstruation. She was talking about monthly cycles, how to become pregnant, contraception. I find that when you talk about refugees, people immediately jump to contraception, but there's a lot great, and not everybody wants always contraception, but certainly there's a great deal of information missing. So those were some of the things that we spoke about at the reproductive health session. And these are actually a couple of pictures from today, earlier on, when we took the women to the street market, which has been happening in this same street as long as I can remember, well over 30 years. It happens every Wednesday. And so we took the women out there, and they came back to the shelter, which is the picture on the right, and people started to cook. Initially under Irene supervision, but we soon realised that they all know exactly what they're doing, and they all started cooking very happily. That said, we definitely had some interesting scenarios when we started. I mean, these haven't gone away because there's like new people coming all the time and many things going on that are difficult to change in depth. But for example, we had, as I mentioned, there were a medical professional who told people to add extra formula to bottled milk and sugar. And we've had people frequently add sugar. When we first went to Scaramanga, there was a big bowl of sugar in the mother-baby area, and people were coming in with bottles of cow's milk and adding sugar to the formula to give babies extra energy. And of course, yes, they were indeed bouncing off the wall for a while, but of course it's not a long-term or a good solution. Women the world over are desperately worried about the lack of supply and about their baby's growth. When we weighed the infants, actually most of them were on their curves. We began doing the growth chart. Most of the babies were indeed growing fine, maybe a little bit on the lower end of the curve, but they weren't all massively undernourished. As Irene mentioned, we've been installing sterilizers or teaching people to use sterilizers for the bottles. And we've also started to coordinate with the volunteer doctors who travel to try and make some, there's an awful lot of sort of emergency, short-term, putting the finger in the dike types of help, and we're trying to work to at least have some collaboration between people. We're starting to talk into some of the baby-friendly hospitals here to see if we can help women to get there for their birth, that kind of thing. And we have instituted growth charts in the shelter and in the camps where we see babies regularly, just to make sure that these babies are actually on their curve, because we didn't want to be telling people, oh, please stop giving formula and just breastfeed, before we had really tracked for a few weeks the baby's weight to know where the kids are with their growth. We also tested the weight scale because it wasn't really, people were concerned it wasn't calibrated. We brought tape measures in to start measuring them. As I said, we are paying a Farsi interpreter, but that's really just through a few private donations. We really don't have any money for that. We're paying already. We trained local volunteers. We have a couple of great Greek young women. Lena in particular is one of our trained volunteers who is a public health student here, and she's been going to the shelter and the camps every week. And so we started going to the shelter every week to track weight and growth of the babies. And we're getting to the point now where we kind of already identified the high-risk babies and feel a little bit safer now to kind of calm down and say, okay, maybe we don't need to weigh every single baby every single week. We kind of know which ones we're watching. We know what kinds of diet they have. We know what kind of problems they have. So what are we going to do next? So I don't usually ask for money on these webinars, but we are seeking funding and donations. We do not have any funding for this project yet, just what we're getting from individual donations and that kind of thing. Most of our work is supported by big grant agencies and foundations, but this work is not. So we're always looking for that, and we're looking for volunteers as well, but we want trained volunteers. I think it's interesting to see the volunteer culture out here. There are lots of people who want to come to Greece for a week and help out, but may not have any skills, particularly in this area, and it's just not, it's not worth it for people to come for a week. But especially if we can get people in Greece or people who can come for some time and have some training, that is very useful. And you may notice also that most of the work that we do at CHIA is training at the healthcare professional level, the curriculum level, upstream, baby-friendly, changing policies. And we're certainly going to be starting to work on baby-friendly in Greece as well. We had a lot of discussion about that this weekend with especially folks from Crete and Cyprus. But right now, a lot of this work is direct service, which is not something that CHIA has done very much of, although we're qualified lactation consultants. We haven't done that much in the past for quite a long time. So that is one new aspect of this work. And we've started to do some training at some of the larger organizations where the doctors and volunteers operate. But I would say that is a huge need. I would also say that it's not easy to get in. A lot of places don't recognize that infant feeding training is necessary to their mission. They think it's just for people who are midwives or nurses with babies in the hospital, and they don't see the relevance until we get through the door of why we should be training preventatively. But when you get to the camp and you see the sugar and the formula and the lack of, hygiene and people not really even knowing the difference between breastfeeding and formula feeding, that's the point where you realize that you really need to train upstream. But it's not always easy to convince people. There's a lot of emergency care. People don't have time. There's a lot of chaos. So it's not easy to do that. And we are definitely looking to collaborate with Greek clinicians and lactation groups. We started a conversation with our Leche League here, which is very strong and very frontline and has done a lot of care, and many of them were at the conference this weekend. So we're hoping to do some more of that preventive type upstream work. And I can't actually see who all is on the call because I'm showing you my screen, but we would be delighted to hear from people to collaborate with us. You're seeing the cheering icon on the screen there. So cheer, of course. Hi guys, could someone mute that phone? If you can mute the phone. Thank you. So Cheer is a bigger organization that is based in Boston University, but we have started a non-profit here, Cheer in Greece, which has a website and its own Facebook page. So if you want to learn out more about the very specifics of this, or if you want to help us through Cheer, they're kind of parallel organizations, and some of them are quite the same people on both occasions. So we'd be delighted if people would like to reach out and give us a hand. And also just, we're happy to publicize our work. We're going to be presenting at 2 conferences, one in the UK, which is a lactation-based infant feeding conference, and then we're going to be also presenting in June at the National North American Refugee Health Conference in Toronto, because we've had our abstracts accepted to those conferences. So it's a little bit of a new direction for us. We're excited about international development. We're really just getting going, and we're really thrilled that we're able to do this one webinar on this international work. It gave you all a bit of a change. It's back to Mississippi next time. But thank you for tuning in, and I'd be very happy to take questions. And let me just escape from the full screen mode, and maybe Paige, who's on the phone and on the call presenting from the US. Has anyone got questions, or does anyone want to type anything into the chat? We'd be very happy to hear from you.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, please type them in the chat box. I'll read them out loud and can answer them. That way nobody will be talking over each other.
And just while we're waiting on that, I just wanted to let you know, a couple of months ago when we were here in Greece, we did do a presentation on international work in emergencies, and the audio was really bad, but this one kind of replaces that one. So if anyone wants to sort of access a recorded presentation, and this is the better one to do. So it will be online, as are all of our other presentations shortly. Does anyone have any questions? Feedback, comments, thoughts? Anyone on the phone working in these kinds of situations want to share any information with us? No? Well, we left plenty of time for questions, but don't want to keep people on the phone beyond their allotted time if they don't want to be. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask them. Okay, well, you can always email your questions to us. Go ahead.
Yeah, a question about how you've tracked growth and if you provide vitamins to the mothers or babies.
What was the first bit? How we what?
They just asked for you to talk a little bit more about growth in infants, and then
growth.
Yep.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, like in terms of the growth, really we didn't even have weighing scales, and the babies, they weren't going to care. Just to sort of back up a little bit, people have access to care here in Greece. It's a free system. They're not excluded from care, but most people don't speak any Greek, and it's extremely difficult to get translators that speak not English and Farsi, but Greek and Farsi. You can probably imagine that's almost impossible. People in those countries don't learn Greek, and people here in Greece certainly don't learn Farsi and Urdu. So lack of translators is a huge barrier to people accessing care. So many people just don't go. And so there was no charting. So basically what we did, we simply got hold of some papers and some weighing scales. We downloaded all the infant feeding charts, the growth charts for the WHO. We printed them out and we started to track the babies. And we have a lot more control, as it were, at the shelter because the same people are there every week and we see the same babies and there's only 60 people there, whereas in the camps you have thousands of people, so we don't always see the same people. Do you want to talk about the vitamins, Irene, at all? There was a question about whether we're supplying vitamins.
We personally, CARE doesn't supply the vitamins, but in the camps, when we do detect, we find that these children, they require vitamins, we inform the people running the camps. Like in Skaramangas, it's the Danish Refugee Council. We inform them and we say, look, you need to inform this particular woman's social worker to make an appointment to get access to medications that she needs. Multivitamins, vitamin D works the same way as well.
Yeah, and I would say that there is probably a massive deficiency of vitamin D. Most of these women are veiled, not necessarily really veiled, but certainly covered. Everything is covered except for the face. The babies are extremely well wrapped up. They kind of think that it's freezing unless it's like 80 degrees. And then, of course, if it's 80 degrees, they don't want to expose them to the sun. So the kids are definitely not getting access to the sun. So I would imagine there's a huge vitamin D deficiency. And it's something, this is why we need to get more to the agency. Some of the babies are getting vitamin D and some of the mothers are getting multivitamins, but it's kind of haphazard. And no, to answer the original question, we don't supply them. We haven't been tracking the babies very long. There is a study out there looking at kids in refugee camps and growth, and they found that many of them are on track for weight gain, but they're not necessarily on track for height gain, which suggests stunting, which suggests lack of a balanced diet. So they may be gaining weight because they're giving them a lot of stuff, but it might not be the stuff that's making them grow very well. And we do definitely have underweight children, with lots of underweight children and small children.
Yeah, I have another question here. What are some lessons you've learned in Greece that could be applied to infant feeding in the U.S. and in Mississippi?
That's a good question. I would say that as providers of care, it really grounds you to see what's going on here. I mean, we get these doctors, I wouldn't say doctors, we get people who, are complaining about things like baby friendly and breastfeeding and saying, that it's not going to be safe or it's going to be, and you get here and the lesson I would learn is that, that there's only breastfeeding really. I mean, that these other things are just distractions, all this fuss about small things and people kicking back against breastfeeding. And when you get out here, you recognize that, infant feeding with formula is simply not safe. It's not safe at any level, not just because of what's nutritionally in the formula, but for all the other reasons. And that's what most of the world is like. So I would say that is the big lesson to be learned, to please look at the basics. And, if we could stop this silly fuss about something's not safe or making a fuss about, skin to skin. And you get out here, I mean, things are just like life and death. There's real life and death stuff going on here. And, it's not a question of change that policy because, how can we possibly put them skin to skin? I mean, all these things, it really gets you down to the basic. It really grounds you. There's really, really important work going on here. And, of course, it's important in other places too. But we should not get distracted by these smaller problems or these silly fusses that people make. That's what I have learned. Any other questions? Maybe just sort of silenced everybody. But anyone get any other questions? It's certainly purposeful what we're doing. There's a lot of value to it. There's a huge scope for improvement. I think baby friendly we're doing in Mississippi. I mean, we did present on Mississippi this weekend a conference to the Greek lactation people, and they were inspired by it. I just want to let those of you from Mississippi on the phone know that. we presented how mortality has been high in Mississippi and breastfeeding rates have been low, and how despite all of that, baby-friendly is taking off. And a lot of the Greek doctors who were there were really inspired by both that and the work that we've done in Indian country, and not the work that we've done particularly, but the work of the people in the hospitals to become baby-friendly. And I think that is great that we can use that work to get people out here. And, of course, not everything out here. I mean, the refugees are a small percentage of what's going on here, but there's a lot of other work going on in the hospital to try and kind of catch up with some of the more evidence-based care. So I think it was great that Chia's work, the work that you all are doing in the hospitals out there, was really inspirational. Anyone got any more questions for Paige or for anyone? Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to be out here in Greece for a couple more weeks or 3 weeks now. I'll be in Mississippi again in May, and so will many of our teams. So we look forward to seeing you again before very long. And keep up the good work, those of you in the US, and anyone who's on the Greek. Anyone anywhere that wants to help us, please shoot us some emails, because this work is new and exciting, and we're really basing it on the great foundation that you all and we all have created together, as knowledge that we've gained from the work we've been doing over the past 30 years. So thank you all, and I hope you enjoyed the webinar. And thanks to our team in the US for coordinating everything through the virtual reality platforms and everything, make sure that this one went smoothly, and that everything was clear. Thanks very much, guys. We'll be back there soon. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.